Finish the ice. I'm good.
That's part of it. I know.
We're going to learn about Reb Chaim of Brisk, whose yahrzeit is coming up. And we're going to learn about the Brisker Derech. We're going to learn about a little bit about him. And then we're going to learn not why, but what. That's the Derech Halimud, the way the Brisker approach is to understanding Gemara. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Chakirah, the analysis, the way the Brisker method that Reb Chaim developed to analyze a Gemara with certain terms like Tzvi Dinim, when you're approaching a complicated question of how to reconcile seemingly a contradictory texts, and you reconcile them by saying, well, there's two laws. Although they look the same, but upon closer analysis, you realize there's two principles at work here, and that would help us distinguish case A from case B. Other chakiros, other kind of analyses of the text that come up with a variety of what we would call a chiluk. A chiluk is similar to Tzvi Dinim, which is a differentiation, a distinction, that we're going to go through various parts of the Torah and say, is this part of the general principle in all of the Torah, or is it because of a specific principle in this particular area of the Torah? Let's say we're learning the laws of Shabbos, and there's a particular law of Shabbos of something that you do that you're not intending to do, but it's going to probably be done. Is that the same principle that would apply to something you're not intending to do, but will probably be done in other areas outside of Shabbos? So these analyses are famous in the Brisker Derech. And a third thing is, amongst the most famous of all of these distinctions is going to be the famous Cheftza versus Gavra, which is translated as Cheftza is the object and Gavra is the subject, and how that plays a big role in the Brisker analysis. We'll give examples. Now it's just the overview. So if you don't understand it, that's good. Because if you understand it, you shouldn't be here. Right? Then how that affects the concept of a Leshitaso, which means when you're reading a commentary on the Talmud, you're studying Rashi, and you're studying Rashi in a particular tractate, should you be expected to find an underlying core principle or principles that Rashi tends to put forward that explains that he has a particular way, a mahalach we call it, which is a particular way of explaining because of some underlying principles that will often explain not just one debate between Tosafot and Rashi, or Rashi and the Rambam, or the Rambam and the Ravid, but will explain many, many debates. Because the whole idea in Brisk is to get to the core of what it is, and its essence of why they're debating. Is it just this area that they're debating, or is there some deeper principle at work? There are antecedents to the Brisker Derech already in the time of the Gemara. There are also antecedents to the Brisker Derech in the time of the Rishonim. and even closer to the time of the Brisker, Reb Chaim of Brisk as well. Then we're going to talk about his love of the Rambam and why that is. And then I want to conclude with his relationship with the Rebbe Rashab of Chabad, of Lubavitch. And then I want to move into the challenge of the Haskalah and the story of the closing of the Volozhin Yeshiva because of the pressure of the Haskalah and the Russian government. And if we have time, we'll conclude with the story of Reb Leivik, or Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, the father of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, of getting smicha from Reb Chaim of Brisk. Okay, that's enough. I think that would be enough.
Was the last name of the Brisker Soloveitchik?
The last name of the Brisker was in fact Soloveitchik. So let me tell you a little bit about the history. I'll tell you a very small version because I intend to tell you more as we go along. And hopefully we're going to do a part 2 next week, because this needs 2 parts. There's some things I left out that I'm not even pretending I'm going to try to cover this week, and there's some of the things that I introduced that we're really not going to have time to fully develop until next week. But let's start with a little bit of the history of Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim was born in 1857. His father was Reb Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, known as the Beis Halevi by the name of his sefer, of his book, who was one of the Gedolim, one of the great Torah scholars of his time. The Soloveitchik family married into the family of Reb Chaim of Volozhin. The daughter of Reb Chaim of Volozhin married a Soloveitchik a few generations before our Reb Chaim of Brisk. So don't get them confused, because there's 2 very famous Reb Chaims associated with the Volozhin Yeshiva. The first, Reb Chaim of Volozhin, the most prestigious student of the Vilna Gaon, opened up the most prestigious yeshiva in Europe in the 18th century, early 18th century, known as the Volozhin Yeshiva. Reb Chaim of Volozhin will get his own day. I'm not going to get into the details of what it meant to be. How do you get to be considered the greatest student of the Vilna Gaon? What does it mean that this the first yeshiva, that weren't there other yeshivas, why was this so special? And that will require its own analysis. But it was a major yeshiva, and he had a student that he saw was exceptionally talented, and he wanted him to be his son-in-law, and he made the shidduch himself. Even though initially the mother of this young man, because his father had died, rejected the shidduch, said he wasn't ready, but ultimately there's a whole story behind that. The shidduch was made, and the rest is history. Now the Soloveitchiks and Reb Chaim of Volozhin are the same family, even though Reb Chaim of Volozhin's last name was not Soloveitchik. But after that, many of the descendants of, not all, of Reb Chaim of Volozhin would be Soloveitchiks. Not all, because he had other children, other descendants. He didn't just have one daughter. No. So, the Beis Halevi had at some point been a co-Rosh Yeshiva, like a junior Rosh, not a junior, but a second Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin, together with another descendant of the original Reb Chaim of Volozhin, named the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi, or they used to call him Tzvi Hirsch, of Naftali Tzvi Berlin. The acronym, we'll just refer to him as the Netziv.
Naftali Tzvi Yehuda, right?
I don't know. Yes, same person. Yeah.
And And Bar-Ilan University is named after him.
I don't know if it's named after him, but
It's Bar-Ilan and Tzvi, the kibbutz.
somebody in his family, right? It's named after him or one of his children. I don't remember. Anyway,
I know that the kibbutz Tzvi is named after him.
okay. It didn't work out for the Beis Halevi, the father of Reb Chaim of Brisk, whose first name is Yosef Dov, which is a famous name in the Brisker dynasty. That was the name of anybody? Yosef Dov Soloveitchik.
The Rav.
Rabbi Soloveitchik of Yeshiva University was named after the Beis Halevi because that's one of the Reb Chaim, Yosef Dov. These are like revolving names in the Brisker tradition, so to speak. You name after a grandfather, a great grandfather. Anyway, eventually the Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the Beis Halevi, moves to Brisk and became the rabbi in Brisk. Reb Chaim learned in Volozhin, and it was arranged that the Netziv saw how special this young student was. He was already related to him because they both have the same ancestor in the original Reb Chaim of Volozhin, but he wanted to have Reb Chaim of Brisk, who was then known as Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. He wasn't yet the Reb Chaim of Brisk. He wanted to have him as a grandson-in-law. He had a granddaughter that he wanted to arrange to marry Reb Chaim. He made the shidduch. He pushed very hard for the shidduch. It didn't go so quickly. And therefore, he used to call Reb Chaim his son-in-law. He was not his son-in-law. He was his grandson-in-law. But because he made the shidduch, he felt like it was his doing, so he would call him his son-in-law. By the way, it's a term of endearment when you get bumped up a generation by your older relatives. You're like, oh, they feel like a son or son, like it's a chiba yisera. Anyway, just to illustrate the brilliance of Reb Chaim, I'll tell you a story. When he was nominated to become the junior Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin, he was only 27 years old. And there was a lot of opposition from various factions of people who either didn't know him and just felt, he's 27, you can't have a 27-year-old Rosh Yeshiva, it's just too young. And other people who did know him felt that he was a danger to the status quo because his way of learning was different. Without getting into why it was different, the fact is it was not the same as the way people were used to learning in Volozhin. And therefore they said, not the guy for us. We want to continue. What do many people want institutionally? The same. They don't want to have any change. It doesn't matter if the new thing is better. They don't want to hear about it if it's not the same. They want everything to always be the same. So those are the two main sources of opposition. Either he's just too young or he's too innovative. We don't want him. Obviously, some people wanted him, including the Netziv, who wanted him, who understood that he was the future, but at the same time, even the Netziv is going to be ultimately challenged because you're bringing somebody in who's young, who's brilliant, and maybe the students are going to like him more than you. So it's always a problem. So it was decided that he was going to have to do a couple things to get the job. And one of the things he was going to do is he was going to have to interview, we call it today like a faher, like, what's the word for faher? A test, an exam. But it's interview / exam with a great rabbi whose name was Rabbi Reuven Dannenberger of Dvinsk. He was the Rav in Dvinsk. he ultimately wrote a sefer called, I think it's called Shevet HaRuvaini, or something Ruvaini, after himself. But at that point, the sefer was not known or not published yet. So he was told he didn't want to do this interview, but he said, look, the yeshiva's paying me. He's very frum. Maybe if I don't do it, I'm somehow stealing the money by not listening to what they want. So he said, okay, I'll do it. And he knew one of the students that he would talk to was a resident from the town of Lubavitch. So he went over to the student. He said, by the way, are you familiar with this rabbi? He said, yeah, sure. He's the rabbi of my town. He said, have you heard him teach? Have you heard his shiurim? He said, no, I haven't. He said, I'll tell you what. I want you to write him a letter with some Torah questions. I'll help you with the details. Don't worry. Don't sweat it. I'll tell you what to write. Can you do that for me? He said, sure. So Reb Chaim helped him write a letter. And he said, do me a favor. As soon as you get a response, come to me. Come to me right away. And sure enough, the letter from Rabbi Reuven Dannenberg comes back to this yeshiva student who's in Volozhin. And he tells Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim reads the letter. And then he sends a message to Dvinsk. I guess it wasn't that far away. I can come, can I come this date for my interview? Yes, come. So he shows up a few days later, a week later, let's say, to the interview. But by this time, what was he doing? Why did he need this? He wanted to see how this rabbi thinks. Listen to the story. So he comes in, and the rabbi says, I'm so sorry. I'm actually just sat down to listen to a din Torah, listening to a litigation between two parties, and I don't think they'll mind if you listen in, but I can't interview you now because I'm caught up with this right now. If you don't mind, sit in and we'll talk later. So Reb Chaim listens to the din Torah. And then the two litigants leave, they get up and they talk a little bit, pleasantries, and Rabbi Dannenberger says, listen, I want to give these people a resolution to their din Torah. I need a few hours, I need 2 or 3 hours to go through their arguments and make up my mind. Come in 3 hours and then we can sit and talk then. 3 hours go by, he comes back, and Rabbi Dannenberger, Reuven, has a pile of sperm open in his study. You can see one's a Gemara, one's a Rambam, whatever it is. He says, come sit down. He says, thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry about the whole din Torah today. And you know what? You were here. You listened, right? He said, do you have a take on what's your opinion about it? So he says, let me tell you. He says, I'm going to tell you what I think, based on what I think you think. I don't know if he said it in those exact words. He said, on the one hand, there's a Gemara that says, in a case like this, listen, this and this is what you should do. On the other hand, there's a Rambam, and the Rambam says something a little bit different than what the Gemara would imply. And he basically walked through this rabbi's whole way of thinking in the last 3 hours when he had been researching and coming to what it might be, but what it isn't, but the final conclusion is, Reb Chaim told him all of the steps that he had just spent 3 hours doing. Reb Chaim told it to him in 5-10 minutes, walked him through what he himself had come up with it. Because what Reb Chaim's genius was is from reading the answers to this young yeshiva student's questions, he understood how this rabbi thought. And then he listened to this case, and he saw the Gemaras and the Rambams that were open, and he figured out exactly where this rabbi was going. And he's like, okay, you have the job. You passed the test. That's a genius. You understand the genius this guy was on? Another story like that. This is another level. I think it was the Telzer Rosh Yeshiva. I think his name was Rabbi Block. It's like these big, another massive going. And they met somewhere for Shabbos Sheva Brachas. And they were talking and learning. And Reb Chaim told Rabbi Block, "What are you learning?" And Rabbi Block says, "I'm learning the questions." If you look in the Gemara, Rabbi Kiva Eger has questions on the Gemara. And I'm coming up with answers of how to answer Rabbi Kiva Eger's questions. And I've done, let's say, 45 of these already. He says, "Tell me one." He tells him one. The rest of Shabbos, Reb Chaim was telling Rabbi Block the other 44, based on his one answer. From one answer, he got how Rabbi Block thinks. So probably the next Rabbi Kiva Eger, these people were just geniuses. They probably knew this, they knew it by heart. Maybe they had to open a Gemara, Rabbi Kiva Eger every once in a while, but they just went, and all of Shabbos this was happening, to the point where they were annoying somebody. So much, it was a Rav in a town that says, "How could you learn like this? There's no way anyone learning the way you're learning knows how to paskin a shaila." So much so that at the end of Shabbos, and he was annoying them to no end, they did like a little duel where the Rabbi, where Reb Chaim said, "So let me ask you a question." There's an actual shaila that happened, and he asks him a shaila, and the rabbi doesn't really. Reb Chaim shows him by a series of answers of how to analyze halacha, that this rabbi is so out of his league in anything, not just in learning, but even in halacha, that he's like, "Okay, you're right." So those are two beautiful stories about Reb Chaim. But the reason why he was able to figure out other people's way of learning is because he developed the ultimate way of learning, a mahalach. By the way, one of the things they say in yeshiva, what are you learning in a yeshiva? What are you learning in yeshiva? Anyone know?
Learning how to learn.
You're learning how to learn. So there's two, what does it mean to learn how to learn? So one thing is to learn how to, what we call learning how to make a laning. And I'm going to be honest with you, I learned how to make a laning when I was 15, then 16, then 17. My laning today is the same level as it was at 17. I didn't grow that much in that. Because by the time I was 17, I could make a basic laning on the Gemara. And I still can make a basic laning today. I didn't become somebody who says, throw away the art scroll, I'll never need it, I don't need it, that's for children, and that's for Amaratzim. No, I need the art scroll. I don't need the art scroll, but I need the art scroll. Meaning, can I learn without an art scroll? In theory, but I don't want to. It's too hard. So once in a while, I don't use the art scroll because I have a lot of energy. I had 2 cups of coffee, and I'm sitting up, and I have nothing better to do, and I'm sitting with the Gemara. But if I don't have all of those things, I don't have the patience and the time to sit and learn Gemara on my own. But in theory, I got what I needed to by the time I was 17 years old of how to make a laning. Because I could have gotten more, but I got what I got. So what did I do since I'm 17? What did I do since I'm 17 in yeshiva? Another 5 years in yeshiva, 6 years in yeshiva, a year in Kaila. What are you doing? No. Chassidus is a couple of hours, 2-3 hours a day. By Misnagdim, Musar, an hour a week, maybe. By other Chassidim, an hour a week. Also, Chassidus. What you're doing is you're learning a mahalach. You're learning how to learn what is Rashi versus Tosfos. What is the Ramban, the Ritva, Reb Chaim of Brisk? You're learning how to learn. Not just how to make a laning, but how different approaches to, and which one is mine? You know when I figured out which one is mine? A few years ago, when I was 48 or 49. That's how long it took me to learn a mahalach and learning. And it was my own journey, and my mahalach is the mahalach of the Mea Shiloach. But before that, I spent a lot of time learning closer to the Brisker Derech. And even now that I learn like the mahalach of the Mea Shiloach, I like to start with a little Brisker Torah on each daf of Gemara, 2 or 3 Brisker Torahs, and I give credit to Rabbi Soloveitchik of Yeshiva University, because through Rabbi Reichman, the smart Rabbi Reichman, that on the Masechtas that I learned, and even when he doesn't have it on a particular Masechta, I already have learned enough of it to know that I can figure out how to learn something with the Brisker Mahalach. So that's what you're doing when you're learning 5-10 years in Yeshiva. After you already know how to learn how to make a laning, how to read the Gemara and how to read the Rashi, you're trying to figure out how Reb Chaim would have learned the Gemara. Okay. Now, what do I mean with Reb Chaim says, when you learn the Gemara, it's not why the Gemara says what it says, but is what is the Gemara saying? The Rosh Yeshiva, the second Rosh Yeshiva of the Panovitcher Yeshiva, who was a great rabbi named Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahneman, Panovitcher Rav. When he was a young man, he was learning in Telz, I think, and they wanted him to see Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim was already older. He was already living in Brisk. He was no longer in Volozhin, because he only spent 10 or 11 years as the co-Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. And the yeshiva helped fund him to go to this like spa where Reb Chaim was recuperating, and he pretended he was just another guy, like, you know, I'm in Vermont and these other rabbis are in Vermont with me. Just coincidentally, it wasn't planned. So he wanted to talk to him in learning, and he started talking to him in learning. And to be honest, he said, Reb Chaim, you know, Reb Chaim was on vacation. He wasn't really paying that much attention. It wasn't that, he was like very calm and not very animated in his response. Sometimes you talk to a great rabbi and they're kind of off. They're not in their natural habitat. You're catching them a little bit off guard. So he wasn't that excited to talk to this young man. He was 17 at the time. Then, all of a sudden, he asked the question, so why is it that the Torah says this and that? Or why is it the Gemara says this and that? And all of a sudden, Reb Chaim, so to speak, got up from his like very subdued self and raised his voice and said, we don't ask why. That's not how we approach the Gemara. That's not how we approach learning. This is the way it is, because the Rebbe Sholom said this is the way it is. We ask, what is it that the Gemara is saying? To understand the Gemara, you have to understand what is it saying. Now, it sounds weird, like you don't ask why. In fact, people ask Reb Chaim, how could you say you don't ask why? The Gemara is a series of questions of what does this mean? Why is this? He says, the Gemara, that's part of Torah. They get to ask why. We have to know what it is the Gemara was saying. Now, let me explain it to you. There's 2 ways of understanding why we don't ask why. One is a theological one. The theological one is that we can be adequately understanding what the Rebbe Shalom's will is, somehow independent of what he already revealed. We're going to somehow figure out what it is he really wants that he didn't say with our own minds. So theologically, he had an issue with that. But much more than that was at stake. What was at stake is if you could come up with why the Gemara is saying what it's saying, because we know the reason for the mitzvah, then you're cutting out what the Gemara actually is saying. And let me explain. I heard from the Rabbi Soloveitchik. I didn't hear it in person. I wasn't around. But he taught down the street in the Mariah. And it's recorded in Yiddish. And he explains what the way of Brisk is. He says it very clearly. When you're learning a Gemara, and you're approaching the Gemara, the Brisker Derech is to understand what the Gemara is saying. Which means what? This is a joke. One of Reb Chaim's children said, my father, I want to explain to you who my father is. The question was asked amongst the brightest luminaries of my father's students. What is a loaf of bread? And he quoted the different chaverim that he had, and each one explained halachically. One of them said, a loaf of bread is something that you're koveya suda on. You make the meal about it. And therefore, it's the most primary thing in the meal, and everything else is like secondary. Therefore, you only have to make a bracha on the bread, and then because it's so important, you have to make a special berachas hamazon. So he gave like a halachic little analysis of what bread is. Okay? And another person gave another kind of construct of what bread is also in the Torah. And this goes on and on and on. And finally, Reb Chaim comes, and they say, Reb Chaim, what is bread? What is a loaf of bread? Reb Chaim says, a loaf of bread is when they take flour from wheat, or whatever it is, and they knead it, they let it rise, they put in yeast, and they bake it in the oven. That's a loaf of bread. Meaning what? First, you have to accurately describe something clearly of what it is. Then, what his students said was also accurate. The only thing is they didn't know what they were talking about because they didn't first define what bread is. So he just went back to the more basic definition of here's what bread is. Now you could say, and now you want to know what else? Bread is what you eat as the main part of the meal, and therefore you make hamotzi and your yotza. You could fill in the blanks of what everyone else said. But if you didn't start with what the definition of the thing is, you're going to be endlessly circling around something that's ill-defined. So the first thing that Brisker wants to do is define what it is that we're talking about. So if we're learning a Gemara, and we don't know what it is, why is only going to take away from the what. It's going to circumvent us asking and answering what it is, what we're talking about. Yes?
Based on this example,
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like Plato, Aristotle, what is a tree, or is this
yeah.
Are they influenced by that, or just it happens to sound similar? Do they have that influence, or is it just
what's happened in the last 40, 50 years, and now it's happening through AI, is that the word for Brisker methodology is become conceptual. It's a conceptual understanding of the Talmud, which means we're abstracting the Talmud. But there's something wrong with that simple. It's true that we're trying to find underlying principles, and then when we find underlying principles, they can apply to multiple cases. Like the Cheftza and Gavra could be applied to many, many situations. So it's true that there's a conceptual level of it. It doesn't necessarily, it's not Neoplatonic per se in terms of forms and things like that. So there are some equivalents of it because it's a conceptual thing, but it's still very much based on the Talmudic text. As we're going to go through it and see. So, let's say, for example, we're learning about Shabbos. And the question is, if I'm not intending to do something, is one category, davar she'ena miskaven. Or another related category is malacha she'ena tzricha l'gufa. I'm doing something, but the consequence of it, which is a malacha, which would be a Shabbat violation, is not the intended purpose of what I'm doing it for. So the question is, and the Brisker question would be, there's a principle on Shabbos that malachas machshavas asra Torah, which means a act that's constructive in nature, not just that it's constructive versus destructive, but there has to be an intentionality in it. The most basic level of it lacking an intention is if somebody gets up, and by getting up, there's something on their lap that then causes, let's say, they were sitting and they got up, and because they got up, they made a flame go on or off. You know, that's not a malacha because the person was getting up. They weren't intending to do whatever it was that was an unintended consequence. So unintended consequence is the opposite of malachas machshavas. So the question becomes, is if you do a malacha she'ein tzricha l'gufa, is it that because it's Shabbos, that it's not a malachas machshavas, and therefore it's not in the category of the forbidden things? Or do we say that no, because malachas she'ein tzricha l'gufa, the fact is, if you know what's going to happen, even if that's not your intention, but the fact that you know that it's going to happen, or reasonably will happen, that makes what you're doing intended. Intention isn't whether you want it or not, and then Reb Chaim is going to find all of these different Leshitasos and different debates between the Rambam and others based on these principles. So I'm not going to get into the principles right now, but that's one of the ways that Reb Chaim will analyze the underlying concept behind something. And then through that, he'll then apply them to these different opinions of the Rishonim. Trying to, that's actually one of the earlier, Reb Chaim's teachings are on the Rambam. They're obviously not just on the Rambam. But we'll talk for a second. We'll skip over Cheftza versus Gavra for now, even though that's the most famous of his Chakirahs. I'll just give you one example. Like Pesach, there's a machlokus between Ein bir chametz el sreifa, right? How do you destroy the chametz? So one opinion says you have to burn the chametz. Another opinion says you get rid of it anyway. Or another opinion says mevatla beliba. You biblically speaking, you don't have to do anything. You just nullify it in your heart. Rabbinically, you have to get rid of it. So what's the nature of the debate? Is the chametz, the isser of the chametz, the prohibition of the chametz, on the Gavra, on the person, that you can't own the chametz. So as long as you don't own it, it's not yours. Okay, rabbinically, they put on you that it's still like, you still have to get rid of it, but how do you get rid of it anyway? You throw it in there, you just take it out and throw it in the city garbage things. It's no longer yours. But if you say the Isser is in the Cheftza, the prohibition is on the chametz itself, it means the chametz itself is not allowed to exist on Pesach. So it's not enough to nullify it. It has to be destroyed. It has to be burnt. So that's like I don't even know if Reb Chaim says that, but I've heard it said, so to speak. So that's using his Cheftza Gavra to explain various stages, and then you could go, because there's various debates on different levels, and you could explain it. That Cheftza Gavra can explain a lot of them. Just in that area of Pesach, and chametz. Now, one of the things about understanding Brisk is really to know that before Brisk, you have a development of Rishonim that went the following way. I'm giving a very simplified version. You had Rashi and the Tosafot. The Tosafot were the German-French rabbis, the most famous of them, like Rabbi Tam and the Ri and not the Rashba, I'm forgetting how to pronounce his name, were descendants of Rashi, but there were many, many other commentators. They were called the Balei Tosfot. So Rashi explains the Gemara beautifully, simply, economy of words, and brilliance. Comes Tosfos and asks questions from other Gemaras. So that's the beginning of a certain level of complexity of understanding the Talmud that would then be developed further when the influence of the Balei Tosfot would transfer into the thinking of the Sephardic Rishonim, like the Ramban and the Rashba and the Ritva, that were like a crossover of, they were like basically Balei Tosafot, because they learned from the Balei Tosafot, were influenced by the Balei Tosafot, but they were also in Spain. They were also somehow influenced by Sephardic Rishonim, such as the Rif and the Rimigash and the Rambam. So there was this kind of synthesis that happened if you study the progression of the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ritva, and then the Ran. This is like 4 generations of this kind of like influence of these merging of ways. And in the Ran is a striking parallel between the Brisker Derech and the Ran, Rabbi Nissan, who came many hundred years before. Why is that? Because they were developing what we call in Yeshiva Lumdus. They were developing analytical skills to get to the root of why things were the way they were in the Talmud. So therefore, the Chidushim of Reb Chaim, there's a big question of what exactly are the Chidushim of Reb Chaim, because almost all of his Chidushim, almost all, not all, but almost all of his Chidushim can be found in a more kernel version, a more like rudimentary version, somewhere already in the Rishonim, particularly in the Ramban, Rashba, Ritva, Ram. Not only, particularly. Therefore, I gave a talk not even a year ago, maybe 5 months ago, in Boston, and there was like a PhD level student there, and it was the talk was about comparing the Derech of Reb Chaim with the Derech of Ishbitz, and the young man was very disturbed by when I was explaining how many antecedents there were to Reb Chaim. He said, "Yes, I know that, and it's so upsetting to me that so many of these chidushim of Reb Chaim are not real chidushim." He was upset. He said, "I complained to my friends about this." I said, no, you don't understand Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim would take something that was mentioned somewhere and apply it to 500 places. It's not the same. It's not the same that something, and fit it in so perfectly. That is the Chiddush. The Chiddush is how he found these concepts that weren't new, that already existed, and figured out how to apply them. You don't have to come, and by the way, some of his ideas were new, but most of his ideas already existed, but it was in its application that was brilliant, so much so. The real Chiddush of Brisk is how well it fits in to everything. Not the idea itself, it's the idea fits like a glove. that when you learn Brisk, when you learn Reb Chaim, and you learn the Gemara, you're like, this has to be what the Gemara means. Or even you think like, I don't know about this, but I don't have a better way. So that doesn't mean that's the way. A couple other things, because we only have 4 more minutes. A couple other things. Let's talk about the Rashab of Lubavitch. Next year we're going to delve more into the meat and potatoes of this actual Derech Halimud. So I could share with you like 5 takeaway things of how to learn with the Derech of Reb Chaim. And now it's more of an overview. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Rashab, Reb Sholom of Lubavitch, the 5th Lubavitch Rebbe, who was a great genius in Kabbalah and Chassidus and Gemara, but his main thing was his explanation of Kabbalah through Chabad Chassidus. They became very close because they had a mutual enemy. The mutual enemy was the Haskalah, was the secularized Jews, who wasn't today like the secular Jews who are not religious, and the religious people and the secular Jews like kind of tolerate each other, not always perfectly, but okay. But back then, many secular Jews were embarrassed by the religious Jews, and their whole goal was to secularize them. So because of that, there was these constant friction between these secularizing forces in the Jewish community that had power because they had government positions or influenced the government. So together, the government and the secular Jews were conspiring to change the nature of the yeshiva to make it what the yeshiva would derisively call a seminary where they would learn Russian and literature, and so they were constantly fighting, and this is kind of being shoved down their throat. And yeshiva, rightfully so, at least for that time, not for now necessarily, but at that time, they understood that it was really the road for assimilation. That's what they understood the fight was. And I say assimilation, I don't mean intermarriage, because now we think of assimilation as intermarriage. I don't mean that. I mean assimilation of the mind and the heart, of leaving the commitment to Yiddishkeit to be a person, not a Jew, to be a Russian, not a Jew, to be a secular, not religious. So the two of them were very close allies, and they would spend a lot of time together on these trips that they had to go to. There were these rabbinical assemblies, but they weren't fun because they were being hoisted on them to defend themselves against the secularizing forces that would sometimes organize these things for them to have to fight off these secularizing powers. The beautiful and interesting thing is, in the beginning it bothered me, but then I understood it deeper and I got it. When people would ask him, why do you spend so much time? They were jealous of the affection and time spent between him and Sholom of Lubavitch. Why do you do that? They would say, his own friends. And they would say, because of his mesiras nefesh, because of his dedication to Judaism, that he's willing to die for it. So at the beginning, I felt it a little bit like almost insulting. Here you have, it would be like saying, what do you think of Einstein? I say, Einstein, he knows how to make good tea. I mean, yeah, the Rashab was willing to die for Judaism, but he was a big guy. He was an Eloi in Chassidus and Kabbalah. He was unparalleled in the whole world. So why are you talking about his mesiras nefesh? But now I understand why. Because he didn't respect Chassidus, but he respected the Rashab. Meaning, he didn't respect the why, because the Rashab's whole being as a Torah scholar was to explain why we do what we do, not what we do. That he left. Not what the Gemara says, but why the Gemara says, why Kabbalah is what it is. So they were diametrically explaining two different parts of Torah. But he said it's his dedication to Torah. It's his unwavering commitment. That truth I know. I don't agree with where he's putting his talents, because I do it a different way. He probably doesn't agree with me either, which actually, you'd be surprised. Chabad eventually went over and became very influenced by the Brisker Derech. But the fact is, what we were saying is, I respect the 100% dedication to God that the Rebbe Rashab has. Even if I don't agree with Hasidus. Even if I'm not a Hasid. There are other people who say that he looked at Eitz Chaim, Kuntrus Eitz Chaim by the Rashab, and he said, this is great, which is about learning that you have to learn Hasidus, not just... So, there's different opinions. My guess is that his preference is that you stick to Gemara and not Hasidus. That is his preference. But he had tremendous respect for the Rashab. And even though they didn't agree on what the emphasis of learning has to be, they agreed totally on working together on saving Judaism, and they tried their best that they could, the two of them together. And thank God both of their paths are tremendously successful till today.
Shakal.
Shakirah.
Yes, Shakal.
Thank you.